The silence of Northgate Manor was a living thing. Elara Vance had cultivated it for 5 years, nurturing it as carefully as she did the hardy winter kale in her garden. It was a silence built of stone walls, miles of empty moorland, and a past she had buried so deep she could sometimes forget the weight of its soil. The house was her shell, her fortress, her world. Tonight, the wind was a restless beast clawing at the window panes, and the rain fell in a steady, percussive rhythm against the slate roof. Elara sat by the hearth in the small parlour, the only room she kept truly warm. The firelight cast flickering shadows over the pages of her sketchbook, where a meticulously detailed drawing of a ghostpipe fungus was taking shape under the fine nib of her pen. Each line was a meditation, a small act of devotion to the tangible world. The curve of a petal, the veining of a leaf, the delicate gills of a mushroom, these were truths she could hold. They did not lie or betray, they simply were. Her fingers, smudged with ink, moved with practiced certainty. This book, filled with the flora of the northern fells, was her private litany, her proof of life. A sudden, violent slam from outside shattered the quiet. It was not the wind. It was the sound of the great iron knocker on the front door, a sound she had not heard in half a decade. Her heart gave a painful lurch, a startled bird beating against the cage of her ribs. No one came to Northgate. The locals knew the estate was forgotten, left to crumble by its absentee owner, the Duke of Blackwood. They knew a reclusive woman lived within, and they respected her privacy as if it were a physical boundary. This sound was an invasion. Her first instinct was fear, a cold tide rising from the pit of her stomach. It was the old fear, the one that whispered of eviction, of being cast out with nowhere to go. She had arrived here with nothing but a small valise and a letter from the Duke's late father's solicitor, a pitying allowance granting her use of the abandoned dower house until her death or his displeasure. She had chosen the main manor instead, for its sturdier roof and deeper well. No one had ever corrected her. The knocker banged again, louder this time, insistent. Annoyance began to prickle through the fear. Whoever it was, they were impossibly rude. She placed her pen down carefully, closing the sketchbook and setting it aside. She would not have her work, her peace, threatened by some lost traveller. Taking up the oil lantern from the mantelpiece, its warm glow a small shield against the cavernous dark of the grand hall, she walked toward the door. Her footsteps echoed, the only sound within the house now that the rain seemed to have quieted, holding its breath. The silence of the house was like a held breath, waiting for a sound it dreaded. She slid the heavy bolt, the screech of metal on metal a protest against the intrusion. Turning the massive iron key, she pulled the heavy oak door inward just enough to see. The wind tore at her, whipping strands of hair across her face and threatening to extinguish the lantern's flame. A man stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the churning grey of the storm. He was tall and broad, water streaming from the shoulders of his fine wool coat as if from a gargoyle. He did not speak, merely looked down at her, his face shadowed and unreadable. Behind him, a carriage and 4 exhausted horses stood steaming in the downpour, a sight so alien in her world it felt like a hallucination. "The house is occupied," she said, her voice firm, louder than she expected. She raised the lantern. The light caught on a face pale with exhaustion, sharp with aristocratic angles, and grim as the winter sky. His eyes, a startlingly deep amber, fixed on her. He finally spoke. "I am aware. This is Northgate Manor, I presume?" His voice was low and rough, like old velvet worn down to the thread. It held an authority that grated on her instantly. "It is," she replied, not giving an inch. "And as I said, it is occupied. You have the wrong house." A flicker of something, not amusement, but a dry, weary irony, crossed his features. "On the contrary," he said, pulling a sodden letter from his coat. I have the exact right house. I am Blackwood. Ilara stared. The Duke of Blackwood, the faceless, distant landlord who owned her precarious existence. She had imagined him an old, dissipated creature of London, forgetting this place even existed. This man was not old. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, though a profound, bone-deep weariness settled in his posture, making him seem decades older. It was in the slump of his shoulders, the tired lines around his eyes. He was a duke. He could cast her out with a single word. The fear returned, sharp and acidic, but it was immediately followed by a wave of defiance. She had survived 5 years here alone. She had wrestled this house back from decay and neglect. It was hers by right of labor and love, whatever his papers said. She looked from his grim face down to the mud caking his expensive leather boots, then back up. She held her ground, the lantern held steady between them. "Wipe your boots," she said, her voice devoid of deference. "You are tracking mud into my hall." For a long moment, the Duke of Blackwood simply stared at her. The wind howled. His coachman looked on, aghast. Ilara felt the fragile structure of her life trembling, but she did not lower her gaze. Then, to her utter astonishment, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back and scraped the soles of his boots methodically against the iron bar set by the door for that purpose. Only then did he step inside. He arrived expecting an empty house. She answered the door with a lantern and told him to wipe his boots, and in that moment, something shifted in the cold, silent air of Northgate. The Duke was home, but the house already had a master. The first few days were a war of silence. He, the Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, as she refused to call him even in her mind, claimed the master suite, a wing of the house she had long since closed off. He did not ask for her help, and she did not offer it. She heard him moving about, the sound of furniture being dragged across dusty floors, the groan of shutters being forced open after years of disuse. He was a ghost in her house, a constant, unsettling presence. She would catch glimpses of him, a tall figure standing by a window, looking out at the endless grey moor, or a shadow passing the end of a corridor. He ate alone, taking the bread, cheese, and cured meat she left on a tray in the hall without a word of thanks. Ilara clung to her routine with fierce tenacity. She rose with the dawn, tended her small flock of chickens, worked in the walled garden preparing it for the first frost, and spent her afternoons with her sketchbook. It was an act of defiance. She was showing him that her life had its own rhythm, one that did not bend to his. Yet she was intensely aware of him. She found herself listening for his footstep, for the sound of his door opening. His presence was a stone dropped into the placid pool of her solitude, and the ripples were spreading, distorting everything. He was an intrusion, a threat, and yet he was also a mystery. Why was he here? Dukes did not rusticate to their most remote, dilapidated properties in the middle of a storm unless they were running from something, or being forced to. His face was a mask of grim control, but she saw the exhaustion that lay beneath it. She saw it in the slight tremor of his hand as he reached for the food tray, the way he stared into the fire as if seeing scenes only he could witness. One afternoon, a week after his arrival, she was in the library. It was her favorite room, with a soaring ceiling and shelves filled with books that were slowly succumbing to damp and time. She was carefully cleaning the spines, a hopeless but necessary task. She had her sketchbook open on the large reading table, working on a rendering of a fly agaric mushroom she'd found near the woods. The door creaked open. The Duke stood there, watching her. He had not sought her out before. Her fingers tightened on the soft cloth in her hand. "The east parapet is leaking," he said, his voice flat. "The water is coming into the blue bedroom." Ilara looked at him, then back at her drawing. "Yes, it has been for years. I keep the door shut. It needs to be repaired. Then you had best send for a stonemason from the village. It is a 3-day ride, if the roads are passable. Her tone was deliberately unhelpful. This was his house, these were his problems. He walked further into the room, his gaze falling on the open sketchbook. He stopped beside the table, looking down at her work. She felt a prickle of defensiveness, as if he were reading her diary. Her drawings were intensely personal, the truest expression of herself. Botany? He asked, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. Mycology, mostly, she corrected him coolly, and other things that grow where they are not told to. The barb was subtle, but she meant for it to land. He did not react, he merely studied the page, his expression unchanging. A hobby, it was a statement, not a question. Dismissive, a life, she countered, her voice quiet but sharp. He looked from the book to her face, and for a second the mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something. Not pity, not contempt. Surprise perhaps, as if he had expected a simple cowed spinster and found something else entirely. He gave another of his curt nods and turned, leaving the library without another word about the leak. The next morning, she was woken by a rhythmic banging from above. She dressed quickly and went outside. The sky was a sheet of pale, washed-out grey. High above, on the roof near the east parapet, was the Duke. He had shed his fine coat for a simple shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he was hammering a sheet of lead over a gap in the stone. Ilara stood in the wet grass of the courtyard, stunned. His hands, she noted, were not the soft hands of a London aristocrat. They were capable, sure. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of physical competence. He was not waiting for a stonemason. He was fixing the roof himself. She watched for a long time, a strange confusion stirring in her chest. This man, this Duke, was not what she had expected. He was a creature of contradictions, a powerful man brought low, an aristocrat with the hands of a labourer. A silent intruder who fixed what was broken. The war of silence began to thaw, replaced by a tense, unspoken truce. She started leaving a pot of hot tea with the food tray. He started leaving neatly chopped firewood by the parlour hearth. They were two solitary planets, but their orbits had begun to intersect in small, gravitational tugs. A few weeks later, the first true snow of winter arrived. It fell thick and fast, a white curtain descending over the moors, cutting them off completely from the world. The isolation was now absolute. There was no leaving Northgate until the spring thaw. The cold deepened, seeping through the stone walls. Ilara found the Duke one evening in the great hall, shivering, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, but a fever-bright glaze in his amber eyes. His grim control had finally fractured. "You are ill," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He tried to wave her away. "It is nothing." But his voice was hoarse, and a cough rattled in his chest. Compassion, an emotion she had long kept locked away, stirred within her. She saw not a duke, not an intruder, but a man, alone and vulnerable. "It is not nothing. You will come to the parlour, by the fire." It was an order, not a request. To her surprise, he obeyed, allowing her to guide him to the worn armchair near the hearth. She brewed a tisane from willow bark and elderflower, a remedy her mother had taught her. As she handed him the steaming mug, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was burning hot. For 3 days, she nursed him. She brought him broth and tea, kept the fire stoked, and sat in the chair opposite, watching him as he drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. In his delirium, he muttered words she could not quite catch. Names, places, a single word, repeated over and over, betrayed. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time in days. He looked at her, sitting in the firelight with her sketchbook in her lap. The room was quiet, safe, you stayed, he said, his voice weak. There was nowhere to go, she replied, her usual tartness softened by circumstance. He was quiet for a long time, watching the flames. Thank you, Miss Vance. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his mouth, formal and yet intimate in the small, warm room. Elara, she corrected him, without thinking. He looked at her, a real smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, erasing some of the weariness. Alistair, he said. The winter deepened its hold, but inside the stone walls of Northgate, something was beginning to thaw. They began to talk, not about the things that mattered, not about why he was here or why she was, but about small things. Books, the history of the house, the changing light on the fells. He would watch her draw, no longer with dismissal, but with a quiet, focused attention. He asked her the names of the plants, the properties of the fungi. He learnt the difference between a chanterelle and a jack-o'-lantern. He saw her book not as a hobby, but as a vast and detailed chronicle of a world he had never noticed. She, in turn, learnt things about him. He had a keen mind for engineering and architecture, pointing out the structural genius of the library's vaulted ceiling. He knew the stars by name, a skill learned on a long sea voyage years ago. He was a man of hidden depths, his ducal title a mere veneer over a more complex and substantive core. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the windows, they sat in their usual chairs by the fire. The shared silence between them was no longer tense, but comfortable. Companionable. Why are you here, Alistair? She asked softly, the question finally rising to the surface. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. She thought he would not answer. But then he began to speak, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if reciting a history that had happened to someone else. He spoke of London, of politics and power. He spoke of a friend, a man he had trusted like a brother, who had been involved in a treasonous correspondence with a foreign power. The plot was discovered. The friend, married with young children, was ruined. He came to me, Alistair said, his eyes fixed on the flames. He begged me to help him. His wife, his children, they would be destroyed. Elara listened, her breath held tight in her chest. There was a duel, Alistair continued, over a manufactured insult. It was a pretense. I wounded the man who was set to expose my friend. It created a scandal large enough to obscure the other, more dangerous one. It was my choice, public disgrace and exile for me, or the gallows and ruin for his entire family. So you chose this, she whispered. Banishment, the slow social death of being sent to a forgotten estate. I took the fall, he said simply. He reached into his coat, which was draped over a nearby chair, and pulled out the same letter he had shown her on his first night. It was dry now and creased. He handed it to her. It was an official decree from the Crown, countersigned by the Prime Minister. It stripped him of his seat in the Lords and banished him to his northernmost property for an indefinite period, a punishment for conduct unbecoming his station. It was cold, brutal, and final. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back. She finally understood the weariness that clung to him like a shroud. It was not just exhaustion, it was the weight of a monumental sacrifice. He was not a disgraced man. He was an honorable one, living in the ruin of his own good deed. Your friend, she said, her voice tight with an anger she felt on his behalf. Does he write? Does he know what you suffer for him? Alistair's expression was bleak. There has been only silence. The word hung in the air between them. Betrayed in that moment, Elara felt a profound and aching kinship with him. She too knew the sting of betrayal. She knew what it was to have your world torn apart by the actions of others. Almost without thinking, Her hand went to her throat, where a thin silver chain was hidden beneath the high collar of her dress. Her fingers closed around the small, cool shape of the locket she always wore. It was her only memento of a life before Northgate. He noticed the gesture. His gaze was gentle, questioning. Slowly, she drew the chain from under her collar. The locket was small and dented, its surface worn smooth with time. She did not open it. She never opened it. "My father was a merchant," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He invested everything with a partner he trusted. A friend. The man disappeared with our entire fortune. My father could not bear the shame. He took his own life. My mother died of a broken heart not a year later." She looked at Alistair, her own story finally laid bare. "We were left with nothing. Creditors took the house, the furniture, everything. I was a gentle woman with no prospects, no family, no dowry. A burden. The Duke's solicitor, your father's man, took pity on me. He offered me this place, a place to be forgotten." He listened, his amber eyes filled with a deep, quiet empathy that was more comforting than any words of sympathy could ever be. He did not offer platitudes. He simply saw her, and in his gaze she felt the old wounds, the shame, the loneliness, finally being witnessed. He reached out, not to touch the locket, but to gently touch her hand that held it. His fingers were warm and strong over hers. "You were not forgotten, Alara," he said softly. "You were preserved." The blizzard howled outside, a storm of wind and ice. But inside the small parlor, by the warm glow of the fire, two solitary souls, exiled by the betrayals of the world, had finally found a shared harbor. The great, empty house no longer felt like a fortress or a prison. It felt like a sanctuary. Spring arrived reluctantly on the fells, first as a subtle softening of the light, then as the slow, grudging retreat of the snow. The sound of melting ice became a constant music, a trickling chorus of release. With the thaw came a change in the air between Alara and Alistair. The quiet companionship of winter had deepened into something more fragile and profound. A hope that bloomed in her chest felt delicate, like a winter rose pushing through frost. They worked together in the garden, turning the soil, planting the seeds she had so carefully saved. He learned the rhythms of her life, and she his. She learned the way he smiled, a rare and precious thing, when one of her hens laid a particularly large egg. He learned the way she hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when she was deeply focused on a drawing. They never spoke of the future. The world outside Northgate, the world of dukes and betrayals and London society, felt distant and unreal. Their reality was the stone house, the burgeoning garden, the shared meals, the comfortable silence. It was enough. For Alara, it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. One bright afternoon in late April, they were on their knees side by side, weeding a patch of earth destined for climbing peas. The sun was warm on her back, and the air smelled of damp soil and new life. Alistair's presence beside her felt as natural and right as the earth under her fingers. The sound came suddenly, a distant thunder that was not thunder. It grew steadily louder, hoofbeats, many of them, and the jangle of harnesses. Alara's heart seized. She looked at Alistair. The brief peace on his face was gone, replaced by a tense, guarded expression. They both stood, brushing the dirt from their hands, and looked down the long, winding track that led to the manor. A rider was approaching at a gallop, his horse kicking up mud. He wore the livery of a royal messenger. The world they had forgotten had remembered them. The messenger, a young man breathless with the importance of his task, dismounted and bowed low before Alistair, holding out a sealed scroll. "Your Grace, a dispatch from London." With the utmost urgency, Alistair took the scroll, his face unreadable. He broke the seal, his movements stiff. Elara stood frozen a few feet away, her hands clenched at her sides. The garden, the sun, the scent of spring, it all faded. All she could see was the crisp parchment in his hand, a white flag from a foreign country come to claim him. He read the letter. She watched his face, searching for a sign. A clue. His expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. He read it a second time, slowly, as if the words were in a language he no longer understood. Finally, he lowered the paper. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a maelstrom of conflict. The weariness was back, heavier than ever. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a thin thread in the sudden silence. "My friend," he said, his voice flat. His wife died of an illness this past winter. On his deathbed, consumed by guilt, he confessed everything. To the crown, to the man I wounded. "So you are exonerated," she breathed. "I am pardoned," he corrected, a bitter edge to his tone. "My title and lands are fully restored. I am summoned back to court." Summoned back. The words fell like stones into the quiet peace of her world. He was the Duke of Blackwood again, a great and powerful man. And she was Elara Vance, the recluse of Northgate. The chasm between their stations, which had been bridged by the shared isolation of winter, had just reopened, wider and deeper than ever before. He looked from the letter to her, then around at the stone manor, the wild garden, the vast open sky. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He was waiting for her to say something, to plead, to weep, to tell him what to do. And in that moment, Elara knew what she had to do. She would not be the passive object of his decision. She would not wait for him to choose her fate. She had built this life with her own two hands. She was the mistress of Northgate, and she would act like it. She met his conflicted gaze, her own clear and steady. "Come with me," she said. It was not a plea. It was a command. She turned and walked back into the house, not looking to see if he followed. She heard his footsteps behind her, hesitant at first, then firm. She led him not to the parlor, but to the library, the room that had become her sanctuary. On the great table lay her sketchbook. She opened it, turning the pages deliberately. She did not show him the delicate flowers or the intricate fungi. She showed him the drawings of the house itself. A study of the leaking parapet before he had fixed it. A sketch of the new timbers he had braced in the stables. A detailed drawing of the stone wall they had rebuilt together at the edge of the garden. Page after page, she showed him the chronicle of their shared work, the evidence of the life they had built, together from the ruins of their separate pasts. When she reached the last filled page, she looked up at him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice was unwavering. "This is my life, Alistair," she said quietly. "This house, this land, this work. It was mine before you came, and it will be mine long after you are gone, if that is your choice." She took a breath, gathering all her courage. London can have the Duke of Blackwood. He is a stranger to me. But the man who fixed my roof, who learnt the names of my plants, who shared his fire and his silence, that man has a place here, if he wants it. She closed the book. "I will not ask you to stay, and I will not beg you to take me with you. I am not a damsel to be rescued. I am a woman in her own home. You can be a part of this life, as my partner. Or you can return to yours. The choice is yours, but I will not wait for you to decide my fate." She had laid her heart bare, not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. She had offered him a kingdom of his own choosing, a quiet place of stone and soil and shared work. She had given him her truth. It was the most powerful thing she owned. He stood there, the royal summons hanging limply in his hand, and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a dawning wonder. He looked at the sketchbook, at her ink-stained fingers, at her proud, unflinching face. He let the summons from the king fall from his hand. It drifted to the floor, a piece of a forgotten world. He stepped forward, closing the small space between them. He gently took her hand, the one that had drawn their story, and raised it to his lips. He did not kiss it like a duke honoring a lady. He kissed it like a man honoring his equal. "I have been a duke my entire life," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard before. "It has brought me nothing but grief and betrayal. I have only been a man for one winter, here with you." He met her eyes, his own amber gaze burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "There is no choice to be made, Elara. I am already home." 1 year later, spring returned to Northgate, not with reluctance, but with a riot of joyful colour. The gardens had doubled in size, sprawling in organised, thriving beds that overflowed with herbs, vegetables, and flowers. The stone of the manor seemed to have soaked up the sunlight, glowing with a warmth that came from within. Elara stood on the newly repaired terrace, a soft breeze lifting the tendrils of hair from her neck. Beside her, Alistair drove a spade into the rich earth, creating a hole for the young apple sapling that lay at their feet. He wore no fine coat, only a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-browned forearms. The profound weariness was gone from his posture, replaced by the easy strength of a man at peace. He had been true to his word. A single terse letter had been sent to London, respectfully declining the summons to court, and formally passing the day-to-day duties of the dukedom to his capable younger brother. He had kept the title, but shed the life, choosing Northgate. Choosing her. Last week, a crate had arrived from London, a gift from him. Inside, nestled in soft wool, was not jewellery or silk, but the finest vellum she had ever seen, reams of it, and a set of German inks in a dozen different hues. Her sketchbook, her private litany, was now a shared project, a grand chronicle of their life. Alistair finished digging and straightened up. Wiping a smear of dirt from his brow with the back of his hand, he smiled at her, the easy, genuine smile that was now a familiar and cherished part of her world. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and together they lifted the small sapling. They lowered it carefully into the earth, its roots dangling in the dark, cool space. Elara knelt, her hands sinking into the soil as she began to pack it firmly around the base of the young tree. Alistair knelt beside her, his larger hands working in tandem with hers. Their fingers brushed, covered in the same dirt, planting the same future. The silence between them was no longer a shield or a weapon, but a shared language, rich with unspoken understanding and quiet devotion. It was the sound of home. She looked at this man, her partner, and at the life they were building from the ground up. She had faced the ghost of her past and had not flinched. She had claimed her own power, not by fighting, but by choosing. True freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of others, but the willed and joyful presence of the right one. Alistair's hand found hers in the soil, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not say a word. He did not need to. In the quiet heart of the northern fells, in a forgotten house brought back to life, two exiled souls had planted their roots, together, and they were, at long last, beginning to grow.